As Paul mentioned, the topic of our talk is presenting some findings on our research project, Cities of Integrity. How can professional communities of planners in South Africa and Zambia drive integrity, battle urban corruption? And on that note, just a few kind of framing remarks on the notion of urbanizing corruption and why we actually need to look more closely at cities when we talk about corruption, anti-corruption scholarship, or also urban scholarship that should look more closely at what corruption can actually do to cities. So this is a recent screen shot from an article that just came out a few days ago. City of Johannesburg's 280 million rand real estate deal crime scene. It involves a large property in Sandton, one of the big kind of most valuable pieces of real estate on the continent. And there have been some untoward dealings and some illicit enrichment in play that has been investigated. And this just shows kind of the scale and the extent of the problem, because urban land and property is the biggest store of value in the world. There are massive values at stake. Urban land is 8 times the value of agricultural land on average. So there's already massive windfalls, financial windfalls that can be made just by rezoning from agricultural and forest land to developable land in peri-urban areas, for example. 70% of global infrastructure spending also occurs in urban areas. And as we know, procurement of infrastructure is another kind of hotspot. And for us, for our geographical context, Africa is the fastest urbanizing region, especially in the growth is taking place, particularly in secondary cities, which is also interesting because there's limited capacity in local government, specifically in secondary cities. They are under a lot of pressure to grow fast, and there's also often a lack of capacity in the local kind of planning community or community of urban planners. So that is kind of to give you the raison d'etre for our project and where the kind of the problem space where we are trying to intervene. So why integrity and why planners? So this obviously, the focus on urban corruption still begs the question, why are we not focused on regulatory mechanisms? Why are we not focusing on disciplinary mechanisms? So I think as last week's talk already really mentioned quite well, there's growing evidence that in contexts where informality prevails, more controls can breed more corruption. That does not mean we don't need controls, but that means we might need a multi-pronged approach that also looks at the promotion of integrity, creating communities that are accountable. And our idea has been to go through the professions, and particularly the profession of urban planners in South Africa and Zambia. And why we think planners are actually important as kind of a community of practice to focus on is explained in a video that we've done as kind of the second installment of a 3-part series. And I'll be showing you this video, and there will be another one further down in our presentation. But this is basically to answer the question, why integrity, why planners?
We know that corruption in urban development is one of the central challenges of our time, and that urban planners can play an important role in tackling it.
We also understand that research from a variety of perspectives has contributed to an evolution of anti-corruption strategies.
In short, a shift in focus from compliance to one of integrity.
So how do we activate the integrity of urban planners?
Here are 3 building blocks to consider.
First, we must debunk a common myth about corruption, that it's about a few bad apples that spoil the barrel.
In fact, evidence suggests that perfectly well-intentioned people can end up doing extremely bad things, if and when context allows. Corruption is not about a few bad apples. It's about the rotten barrels that can tarnish even the good ones. We all tend to overestimate our capacity for goodness and underestimate the slippery slope into corruption.
So the focus must be on designing good barrels, an institutional context that encourages integrity, all the while remaining humble and alert, because it's easy to become corrupted.
Second, let's focus on the integrity of urban planning as a profession. Currently, most efforts to promote integrity focus on individuals and their conduct, or on organizations and their culture. Yet there's another potent but overlooked way to promote integrity: the professions.
Professional communities form strong shared identities, offer continuous training, and run their own ethical infrastructures, such as code of conducts and licensing systems.
This means professional bodies, like planning associations, can nurture norms of integrity, provide practical tools for realizing them, and prevent or call out corrupt conduct when it occurs.
Third, integrity is at the center of the social contract between the planning profession and society. Society trusts planners to use their skills and expertise in the best interest of their clients and the general public. Professional integrity and fiduciary duty, as well as a commitment to inclusive, fair, and participatory processes, are thus foundational principles for planners and their professional community.
Therefore, we need not start from scratch. Already there is a thriving set of values here, as well as ongoing debate about these values to build on.
So, to recap, activating the urban planning profession for building cities of integrity is as important as it is promising.
We must take into account the lived experiences of planners and work with planning bodies to provide support infrastructures and training that empowers planners to play their part in realizing urban development that is just, inclusive, and not derailed by corruption.
All right, so this was the first, well, actually it's the second video of our series of 3, but I think it answers the question why we focus on planners, and that's particularly their deep involvement in key decision-making around urban development, also their intersection, or the intersection they sit at between public and private interests, and also the fact that they are given a fiduciary duty that is policed or managed or regulated through planning bodies. And we have particularly worked in South Africa with the South African Council of Planners, and in Zambia with the Zambian Institute for Planners, which were our kind of critical interlocutors, or we were their critical interlocutors. And Gilbert can say a bit more on the Zambian context. I just quickly, before I hand over to Gilbert, want to give you an idea of our methodological approach, which kind of was the way in which we gathered our data that Gilbert is going to present now. What I think is our particular innovation is the qualitative action experiment, which was a training course, which we coupled with baseline and end-line surveys and follow-up interviews in order to kind of understand how to best kind of build and nurture a community of integrity champions in kind of the Zambian planning community. And with that, I will hand over to you, Gilbert.
Thank you, Rora. Thank you, everyone. Great background and great video. We can go to the next slide. Sure, great. So I'll run through some of the key outcomes, particularly focusing on the statistics, which we did that came out of a survey that we did on the planners both in Zambia and South Africa, just to understand how they encounter and navigate corruption in their professional space. So while progress is being made, even in our project, when we did a survey and asked the planners how they encounter corruption, it is something that is still worrying to note that way more than half of the surveyed planners actually indicated that they have faced challenges to ignore their own their own standing, their own training, their own professional judgment on certain planning decisions, to ignore existing planning regulations, and also to ignore procedures or to manipulate procedures in the planning process so that they achieve a particular end to satisfy a particular corrupt element. This is noted both in Zambia and Lusaka, except for Zambia, the percentage was much higher, almost somewhere around 70%. But when you combine the two, the situation doesn't look very good. The planners face pressure from all sorts of forces, from the political leadership, from the private sector leadership, and sometimes from a collusion of forces between the private sector and also the public sector supervisors. And sometimes they are cornered in a way that they actually struggle to practice planning as they learned it in school and as prescribed at law and also urban development procedures and processes. So that shows that technically planners and professional and technical planners are under intense pressure from external forces to make them do the wrong thing, so that one or two individuals can benefit privately. A few indicated they have never been ordered, but when you combine the two, those who are occasionally, those who are sometimes, those who are often, the picture doesn't look very good. Next. Then we did ask the planners how procurement of planning services has sometimes been done in a way to benefit a sectoral interest. And the procurement services in the planning work are many. Some is infrastructure, others is actual planning work, and in other cases, it is how the public participation is supposed to be done. Maybe they would hire a private person to facilitate such a conversation so that it is really neutral, encompassing, and also indeed provides inbuilt mechanisms to ensure that manipulated processes are sort of curtailed by public input. And what we found is that the planners who are young in terms of professional experience, that's 5 years and less, tend to have similar challenges in terms of being approached and being sort of forced or willingly participating in the manipulated procurement process to influence the hardwiring of infrastructure or the decision-making process, or shaping cities in very long-term ways. Those with few years tended not to be really the major entry point, though over 60% of them indicated that they experienced such problems. What is of interest mostly on this graphic is the middle career guides, 5 to 10 years, seem to be the entry point. And why they seem to be the entry point in this case is that they interface between the juniors, who are sometimes draft people, they are people doing field work and capturing the data, and then the middle guys interface with them to respond to the directives and decision-making requirements that the seniors, so maybe at director level or assistant director level, with 10 years and more. And so the corrupt elements or the manipulative forces seem to know where do you target. You target the junior, the journey will be longer, maybe the cost of doing the corruption might be much far. But the middle guys, they will be able to influence a backward process of the data and information generation, and then the forward process of decision making, this feeding into the people who actually make the decision. So the guy on top might actually be making a decision without knowing that the whole process has been rigged by the guys who are feeding to the process. And then the juniors might be technically just be taught to do certain things by the middle guys. So that seems to be the entry point, with almost 70% of the planners we talked to in both South Africa and Zambia indicating that that age group, in terms of experience, seems problematic. And they occupy a particular level of influence to influence the decision making and also to influence the input in the planning process. Next. Right. Then we also engaged with the planners to find out how often the developers or other interested parties offer them bribes, offer them money, offer them promises, offer it's interest they ever and those who have been offered, of course, when you add them together, they are more in number. Those are occasionally, sometimes, and often they are quite a number. And this was quite, skewed towards Zambia. This finding is interesting in that sometimes the guys who are influenced to make corrupt decisions is sometimes not because they are going to gain something, but it's because the entire process is manipulated from the beginning to the end. And sometimes because they are not really being offered a favor, but they fear that they could be isolated by the senior guys or by the powers that be, especially if there's collusion between political in-state actors and a private sector, who usually found that they tend to work quite closely together. So sometimes it's a matter of safeguarding their job, not that they're getting anything. And sometimes for Zambia, we found a situation where they're actually quite on the vulnerable side with limited opportunities to push back or just to do the right thing because they fear to be isolated, they fear not to be included on programs, and in the end, they may have no financial gain or material gain per se, but they have to follow the procedure because the directive things might come in form of a directive, maybe to expedite works, but in the process there's manipulation in the whole undertaking of the planning the activities. Next, Laura. Then when we ask the planners to think about the future, where they're coming from and what they think about corruption in the urban sector, it is not surprising to us that those who think corruption is somehow going to increase for Zambia is nearly half. And we really are coming from a background, political system and also development practice where corruption almost became a normal thing. And in the land and urban development sector was not exceptional. Hence you see that 41% where planners were taken basically worried that corruption is overtaking everything. And the examples are numerous to show where things really went wrong. Right now in Lusaka, there was a development program on a very key water resource area, which if damaged, Lusaka might lose nearly 20% of its water. That is water for drinking and industry. And 2019, this thing went through a normal planning process and approved, and the forest was to be degazetted. Matters went to court. The matters couldn't stand because the planning process was seemingly done in normal. When government has changed, the same planners were quick to say this was wrongly done and development in that area is suspended. This is a space which has attracted not less than $4 or $5 million in foreign direct investment, particularly coming from Asia, from China, with the Zambian politicians participating in the whole process. It's just an example. There are several others. And so they have indicated the level of worry that we don't see Lusaka surviving, particularly in the water sector, because approvals are being done without much due regard on the due process of the planning work. For South Africa, the trend is a bit better. The worry level is about 28%. And basically, those indicating a decrease are very few. It's interesting to note South Africa, a decrease at 16%, and the decrease for Zambia is at 28%. All these, when we dissect and look at the interview data, we see a mix of experiences, all painting really a negative picture. That the urban sector, the planning sector, and urban development sector is really under pressure. And it's because of the urbanization rate, limited services, everyone trying to fight for a small component and survive. And so the powerful ones are trying to jump the queue and get what they need to get, in the process compromising the common good that we need to get in the cities, which technically, that's why we come to the cities, to share electricity, to share water, to share energy. But a few are seen to be pushing their spaces. Next, Roa. Yeah, and when we noticed that we have this problem, and we did this study is solid as a problem in the planning sector, we did a qualitative action experiment. And the goals really were to increase a level of awareness on the consequences of corruption for an individual, for a profession, and also for the urban space, which is a shared space. And then we raise the awareness for how people can actually survive while avoiding to be caught in the web. And we called in on experts, including Transparency International Zambia, chapter, Transparency International Zambia, Zambia chapter president, and also global vice president, who shared how planners can actually survive in this very complex environment. Then the principles largely were to explore ways on how we can practically build trust, increase the participation, and follow up on each other to have a community of integrity champions, a network and community of practitioners that really put integrity as something important. A community that can influence one another, support one another, and increase their level of leverage to ensure we have a sustainable, inclusive urban space for Zambia. We spent fantastic time talking to planners at different levels, including people from the private sector. Next. And after, we did, before we did a QA, we did a mean survey just to understand what planners think about reporting a crime. It was interesting that the planners really feel vulnerable if they report. The Whistleblowers Act is there in Zambia and South Africa, but they don't feel really protected. They don't have a system. So very few, if you check on the graphic, over 40% indicated they're not likely to report a crime, a corruption issue in their professional work. After our QA, and then we did a second QA, we did a survey again to understand if this is changing. We found a very interesting picture. The planners indicated that they feel the QA bring over 39 people together. It created a sense of oneness, a sense of shared burden, and a sense of support. They can call on one another. And also they thought the Zambian Institute of Planners was sort of brought closer to the professional during the QA. And it became much easier to share the burden and also to consult on how to deal with an issue that might be affecting a single individual and maybe a directive or something to do a wrong decision. So we found a changing trend after the intervention, that planners feel much prepared to report and also to share the burden and also to solicit for advice in an event they are faced with a problem. This was very encouraging to us, and the interview information actually confirmed this type of an outcome. Next. Thank you. We can listen to a video now.
Meet John, head of the planning unit in the local municipality of a Zambian border town. He's busy drafting a plan to formalize stall ownership rights for a popular downtown market. Close to 1,000 traders work here, so demand for stalls is high. John and his team must ensure that they're allocated fairly, are offered to existing occupants first, and that women are given equal access. During the allocation process, some applicants offered John a bribe. When he declined, they were shocked, and some were angry. This is not surprising, as close to 1 in 5 Zambians say they've been asked to pay bribes for public services. At the same time, the most vulnerable were in danger of being excluded. When John's team mapped stall ownership, they noticed many of the stalls were in the hands of local power brokers. One day, John is approached by an older woman who has been trading in the market for many years. She doesn't have an ID and can't afford the application fee, so she is convinced that she will lose her stall and her livelihood. When John deliberates with his team, they reiterate that stalls need to be distributed fairly, and so decide to waive requirements for the older woman. When they tell her she will receive a stall, she is surprised. Is this real, or just an allocation on paper, she asks. Like John, planners often find themselves in difficult situations where choices are not straightforward, and it is easy to slip into corruption. All too often, planning outcomes are derailed by bribery, unequal power, and political struggles. In our survey of about 100 Zambian planners, a majority of respondents have felt pressured to act unethically at some point in their career. Nearly 3/4, 73%, have been asked to ignore or violate procedures to engineer a particular outcome. And more than half have been offered money or illicit favors. When they report corruption, 56% say they've experienced negative consequences, such as demotions or undue transfers. As a planner, what can you do? First, be alert to compromising situations that can be used against you later. When you are faced with a dilemma, seek assistance from your peers, your professional association, or local anti-corruption organizations before things go downhill. Planning integrity means having public interest and fair outcomes at heart. It means standing up to powerful interests, but also being flexible where rules harm the most vulnerable. Whenever the woman from the market sees John now, she happily shouts, "This is my son, who helped me own the shop that keeps me alive." And for John, this is the ultimate reward.
See, what is in the video is based on one of our in-depth case studies in Zambia. It's a true story based on a real experience. And the competition for services is fear. Many people have been pushed out of their lifelines to pave way for sectoral manipulative interests. So this just demonstrates the level. The political forces, the traders, and the in-between arbiters and gatekeepers would facilitate all those kind of channels. The guy who told us his story and we visited the site has written several pieces to us, just indicating how he's navigating all this. I should mention, he eventually said, I think I have to leave. He's now in the private sector. And he's telling us a different story. We keep tabs on him quite closely. Next row. And what we think now is what we do with this. We are definitely connecting with the planners. We have a fair grasp of the complexity of the issue. And we've learned a lot about how planners experience, how they encounter corruption, how do they perceive their friends, and sometimes good and bad eggs, and champions of integrity. It's a basket of everything. but obviously we're getting a good number of them really getting strong and getting vocal. And then essentially we are appreciating as researchers, how the planners themselves reflect upon themselves. They are calling their duty versus various forces and demands on their work. That is another level of engagement, something that we really couldn't appreciate much. And what I've presented is just a mindscape. There's a lot that we went through the process. Then we, from our QA qualitative action experiment, we have some clear indication that building a network of integrity champions within the planning profession can add a great deal of value to the way we fight corruption and ensure fair play in the urban space, particularly on land and urban development decisions. There is a lot of good stuff there. There is, having a fallback, having where to report even if you feel you can't fight it yourself, where you can go and pour the tears and cry sometimes and be heard. All that is what we're able to achieve in the QA. And also opening it up to a conversation. Usually it's quite dangerous for a profession to start talking corruption. But what the QA did is opened the subject. Planners can really talk freely, even on our WhatsApp groups. It's a subject that has become and is with us. Then, we also appreciate and have a better understanding of how enforcement measures, the law which are there, the policies which are there, and how the planning professional bodies can build on that to advance integrity thinking and integrity ideals in their work, riding on the very regulatory mechanism. Say, look, when you do something better as a professional planner and avoid falling on the wrong side of the professional practice, these are the rewards that one might get. We've been discussing a number of things in that space. And we feel quite confident at this stage that our approach on training courses, our materials on corruption, they can make a difference, and they're adaptable to other contexts, particularly in fast-changing urban contexts. We do think our videos can also help tell a narrative, build a narrative that this is the challenge we have. It's the elephant in the room, and these are some of the ways we can deal with it. Practically, in terms of concrete support to the Zambia Institute of Planners, we have been our comrades in arms, basically, in dealing with this subject. We're working together very closely, and one of the areas is our input into the code of practice. The discussion is that how can we implement it now so that it reinforces the value part and the legal part. So a mix of the two with integrity and values of professionals being the forefront, the forerunner. Then if that fails, how can we invoke the policy and regulation on wrongdoers? So we're sort of trying to balance the two and see how we can help grow the profession in Zambia. And we are constantly having a conversation around this, and we'll be discussing it on the 25th of November when there's an annual conference of planners in Zambia. And we'll be participating from this end. Thank you so much. Back to you, Rhoda, and the others.
Thank you, Gilbert. I would just pass it on to Ambika. Thank you very much for listening to us, for watching our videos. As you can see, there was a lot. We've done a lot. There's a lot to still unpack. But we'd appreciate any comments and questions.
I'm going to jump in, and anybody else have questions, feel free to either raise a hand or you can put your name on, you can put the question on chat. But I had a couple of immediate questions, and this is something I'm curious now that you've had the results from the QAE and with how well all of this has gone in terms of the social norming and also how they've been received in terms of your animation. Even though Johannesburg and Zambia have a very unique set of issues in terms of urban planning, it is true that many areas in Africa are also experiencing this, if not areas in like India, South Asia, and in other parts of like low and middle income countries. So my question is, like, are you intending to scale this like in Lagos, or scale this like in East Africa, or scale this in other parts? Or for people who want to, what would you say is your recommendation? Because I know so much of this stuff is culturally specific. And I'm just curious, like, because I think urbanization is a global problem, and it's very much related to like a lot of the climate crisis and all of this other stuff. So I'm just curious, like, how can we move the work that you've done and proven to be successful more into something other people can replicate?
Should we respond right away, or should we collect? I see Johannes and Paul also have their hands up.
Yeah, we can collect if you want. Johannes?
Great. So I was going to say, thank you so much. One of the questions that will come up by many people is this question: how can you scale this? And as it turns out, Ambika precisely asked that. Now, my question here, and I'm playing a little bit devil's advocate, is that, you know, looking at your takeaways on your last slide, you seem to be navigating a somewhat of a tipping point between, on the one hand, highlighting, yes, additional disciplinary ideas, you know, some control, some perhaps curtailing of discretionary items is useful if and when it comes from the profession itself. But on the other hand, it is really about building integrity. So you're trying to navigate this a path between top-down and bottom-up approaches to agreeing within the profession on what matters, for what reasons, how can we go about that. And one of the things that comes out of work on social movements and civic movements more specifically is that the way to sort of oftentimes navigate these is not to try to scale the same approach, the same manual, and make it a pamphlet or a manual that can be applied across context, but to really identify where you have people who are excited to personally engage on these questions, who have personal stakes in it, to guide this group of people who want to do something that is useful and important. So building on Ambika's question, which I think will come at you and comes at all of us in this anti-corruption space, do you have thoughts about your own role in guiding this particular process, and sort of the utility of being invested in figuring this out jointly with people as a bottom-up effort? And how could one think about a profession and identifying people to perhaps ask them, would you want to replicate this in your own ways? What are ways, have you thought about that? And are there maybe examples that you've heard of, or is this something you've tested in other urban planner strategies before, if it was not corruption?
Awesome. Thank you, Johannes. Paul?
Thanks very much. I always love watching those animations, which I think are absolutely brilliant, and I really like this project. But the question I have also picks up on that final slide but in a slightly different direction, because obviously it's really important, the work that you're doing in regard to trying to tackle corruption in planning, and I think the idea of calling on professions in a sense to act professionally is really important, because if you think about what professions are, I mean, one of the defining characteristics of professions is precisely that they tend to reflect very high levels of training, skills, education to get success in, which in turn generates trust on the basis of the fact that there is all of this skill and so on. So focusing on professionalism within the planning profession makes a great deal of sense. But I'm interested in terms of urban development and the kind of corruption that we've seen in regard to urban development. Obviously, one site of corruption, which is universal, widespread, global, and massively important, is corruption in construction. And I'd like to just ask you to comment on the relationship between the planning process and the construction process, because once you've got through the planning, obviously then the people that are actually putting up whatever it is that's been planned are operating with a different set of people and a different set of kind of intermediaries. So do you think there's any evidence from what you've done, or have you even looked at this question in any detail, that if we can improve things with the planning process and get, you know, a greater commitment to acting professionally, will that help us? Can that help us in dealing with some of the problems around the construction process, where, you know, much of the most egregious corruption in terms of urban development is actually taking place? Thanks.
Awesome. So I think we'll stop there and have you talk a little bit before we ask another set of questions.
Sure. Gilbert, should I just take the first two questions and you take the last one on planning and construction? Because I think you're a even better place to exemplify this. So on the question of scalability and also replicability, I guess that was also the reason why we've worked quite closely or in critical conversation with the local planning associations. And even within those, you can see, I mean, from our attachment and our the scale of our project in Zambia versus South Africa, that obviously there is a different degree of commitment in the different planning bodies to our project, and that has to do with the maturity of the profession, the growth of the profession. Zambia has a very dynamic, young kind of cohort of planners, a lot of them having recently come out of planning programs. So there is a lot more leeway there to shape practice and shape minds, but also in Zambia, you have to be registered with the professional body. So there's actually a possibility to add a lot more bite. And that's why we're not ruling out disciplinary measures. And by disciplinary measures, we mean there was a lot of asking, like conversations between representatives from the Zambian Planning Institute and participants in our workshop to actually say, your disciplinary mechanisms need to become more visible. They need to have more bite. They need to bear down on people harder. So that was the request that we've seen, you know, being levied directly at the institute. But for us, it also talks to the role of education as well. So that is why we believe that our training module can be adapted to kind of different planning masters curricula. And we have had conversations through the Association of African Planning Schools in how we can maybe, you know, use this module, and it can be used as a stepping stone in particular, in a particular context, and then kind of adapted to Lagos, adapted to experiences in Johannesburg, to experiences in Nairobi. And even in our qualitative action experiment, we did unearth Zambian specific conflicts of interests that are coming out of some specific configuration of the planning community in Zambia and planning processes. So I do think there is potential for scalability, there's this potential for replication, but it obviously needs to then be taken up by somebody that, you know, would add their own twist to it. There's not a universal, I guess that also makes us Southern urbanists. You know, there's not a universal answer that we're gonna provide, because we critique the issue with universality in all our work and what we do. So yeah, I'll leave it at that, and Gilbert, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much. Picking from where you ended, there is scope for replication indeed, but not to scale up to global levels. At the same time, there's scope for deepening this type of work. We engaged with the planners, but in the process, we found a cocktail of other actors that have influence. Maybe, who knows, if we got the councillors in the room, if we got other regulators in the room, we could have gotten even a much bigger impact through the qualitative action experiment. In terms of why we think walking a thin line between the punitive top-down component and the value-based professional practice, yes, Aurora made a reference to a clear sense of conflict of interest within the community of planners that we found in Zambia. And those issues remain unresolved. And the Institute struggles to take a very firm position because there are certain rationalities that have been advanced. And by the end of the day, what we end up seeing is that we have a group that seems really forward-looking and really looking professional and thinking how to become more professional. But there are a few others who have an argument why they act the way they act. And so there's need to carefully look at how that positive forward-looking people of high integrity and wanting to influence others, how we can build on that before we can think of how else we can say, if you don't comply in this manner or in a particular standard, this is what comes your way. So that's what we are thinking. In terms of the relationship between planning and construction, indeed, a lot of corruption happens in construction. But the example I referenced on the water sector is a huge construction site, that could have changed the water landscape for the city of Lusaka. And it's purely a matter that came out of corruption. There's no debate about it. The relationship in that particular project and several others is very clear between what planners do and what the construction staff works. First of all, most large construction projects begin with a planner's decision. It's the location, where will this project be and what will be the alteration to the existing environment, both sense of place, physical, natural environment, and natural resources. That argument. The people to finally approve that this project needs to go ahead. Even the picture that Rora showed in Santon, Johannesburg, the planner had a signature at some point. Perhaps the only profession, even a president, will require approval from a planner. Now, that point, if that point is reached, then the location becomes a problem. Now, if the location becomes a problem, it touches on displacing the people, killing nature, and all those kind of things. The second link is the standards. In most cities, they are prescribed building codes, and infrastructure need to fit within those codes. And if the people to finally okay that this is a 2-story kind of area building code, or 5-story or 1-story, the decision to make there is the planner, and that's where again the manipulation can happen. The other point is the cocktail of public participation processes from the tail to the head. The person who handles that type of work again is a planner, and that again can be manipulated. The other point is building controls. Who basically certifies what was committed in the designs and the programs, that this is what we are going to build. The person to certify the building for occupation, at least for Zambia, you need actually certificates of occupation from a local authority, which is the planning authority, is the planner. And all those levels, corruption can occur. They come to inspect how I built my house. I didn't build in the right place and with the right parameters. I corrupt them, that's the game over. The certificate will be issued and I become a hazard to the community. Then the last part I would mention, in most cases, including one of the large projects that we had in Zambia, the decongestion project, which I think was worth $250 million to decongest Lusaka. The planners were the core team there. So engineers, quantity surveyors, they were all together. And the planners were there because this was a transport project in the city. Their participation on that team, if they are men and women or people of high integrity and they know their job and they know their calling, they can sway 1 or 2 decisions, or they can whistleblow, or they can report, including how the procurement of the same construction services was done. But if they are part of the corrupt elements and they lack a support system, they will observe and keep quiet. So the planners have a huge role in how actually cities come about. Literally everything that happens, there is either action or inaction by a planner, and hence we see what we see in our cities. Thank you.
Wow, that's a really powerful statement. Yeah, I really appreciate that. I was telling Paul we should round up, but I have one more question for you. In terms of your relationship with governments and in terms of like policies that are actually happening, how have you found you've been able, like, are you working with governments directly in terms of the work that you're doing and then trying to influence like another layer of what's happening? Or do you feel like the governments already have these laws and you're really kind of addressing the implementation gap?
Great, I can pick that first, and Roy can come in, and I'll speak quite a lot on Zambia. The Zambia Institute of Planners is basically a government agency, a creation of an act of parliament. It's an interesting arrangement, but they are an extension of government to regulate the planning practice in the country. So we engage with them quite a lot, and we engaged in this project up the level of the minister, who, if we show some of the recordings we have from him, is now former minister. He made a clear acknowledgement of how he sees corruption playing itself in the planning profession in Zambia, and acknowledging and admitting the failures and the gaps and the need to rethink and also be critical on some of these things with an approach on integrity. We reflected a lot. The Anti-Corruption Commission for Zambia was part of this project. They were in the room when we were discussing this project. And one of the things that they like doing is integrity committees. We dissected that issue, and planners made a very damning reflections on how those integrity committees, particularly for local government planning authorities, as planning authorities, how people perceived that these committees have been created to monitor and watch planners. And so planners sort of felt targeted and left other entities without, saying this is a complex issue. Even legal people actually sit on the team before the planner finds and makes a decision. So it's sort of, in a nutshell, they definitely acknowledge that there's a huge problem and there's need to think differently in the way planners do their work in Zambia, which made it easier somehow for us to actually begin to innovate together, including this code of conduct. The calling partially was from the minister.
Awesome, thank you. I'm actually gonna stop talking and I'm gonna hand it off to Paul.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you to all of you who have participated in this presentation. I hope you found it as interesting and valuable as I did. I've just put into the chat the website for the GIS program as a whole. Please make sure you copy that and go and have a look, and you can see all the things going on, all the different projects and different events that we're running. As I said right at the start, this is the second in a series of presentations that we're running, which will run between now and March, in which all of the various different projects will be presenting their findings in relation to some of those key principles about the anti-corruption evidence program that I mentioned at the outset. So next week, we'll have a presentation from Jackie Harvey, who will be looking at a key real-world priority, which is how we can identify beneficial owners in order to prevent the laundering of corruption and aid in asset recovery. And she'll be looking at that with particular reference to Nigeria. So I hope you can join us for that. Thank you very much for having been here today, and hope you have a good rest of the day, whether that's the whole day, part of the day, or just a little part of the day, depending on where you are.